My name's John Hannon. I'm the Chief Exec of GMCVO, and as part of our work, we've started running a number of seminars that give people a chance to listen to academics with something interesting to say about work we might be involved in, give us a different perspective on the operating environment we're working within. And really pleased to welcome Emma Dowling, who's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Vienna. And the joy of online meetings is that you get to speak to people who aren't just around the corner. And as much as it's great to have a number of you from different parts of Greater Manchester who might struggle to get into the city centre on a Thursday evening, I'm sure Emma would struggle to get in to the city centre from Vienna. So what we found in a lot of our work is the importance of care as a factor. We've worked, GMCVO has had some very large programs against supporting young people to employment, making engaged from the communities. Throughout the life course, you find that people have involuntary care burdens that stop them doing what they want to do, being who they want to be, and living fulfilling lives. And so while it's not been a primary focus of our organisation, it's something that keeps coming up. One thing that did help me kind of get a sense of what the challenge was around this was a book called The Care Crisis by Emma. Unfortunately, because we are online, I'm not going to get my book signed tonight, but I do recommend the book. If you go onto the Verso website, I think it's 20% off at the moment. If you wait until January, there's sometimes a 40% sale, so you might want to add it to your New Year sales list. But without any further ado, I want to hand over to Emma. Just please do drop questions in chat as we're going through. What I'm keen to do is I'll ask some questions later on based on the questions you ask, but also based on your conversations as well. So yes, please do pay attention to what Emma says, but do have a conversation, a dialogue in the chat, and I'll use that to create a set of questions in the last 15 minutes. So Emma, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, John. And thanks very much for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, be there, more rather, be here in the ether, in the online ether with you all, and be able to connect with you, even though I'm here in Vienna and most of you, I assume, are somewhere in or around Manchester or somewhere in the UK. Thanks also for mentioning my book. The talk that I'm going to give today is very much based on the book, and you're already mentioning January. I also wanted to let you know that in February there's actually a paperback edition of the book coming out with a new afterword on the COVID pandemic and care. So you could even wait till February if you wanted to get the book with that afterward. The book itself draws on sociology, feminist theory, and political economy to really, it tries to weave together sort of theory, but also facts and figures and statistics about the situation of care and on-the-ground experiences of care. And what I tried to do in the book is really to try and link the subjective to the structural, so to speak. I set out to speak to different people who were or are involved with care in some way, whether that is in an unpaid capacity, or whether that is an informal carers, or whether in a paid professional capacity somehow, or whether also involved in caring relationships and receiving care, or also doing things that we might not normally associate strictly with care, such as activists who are helping refugees, for example. And what I tried to do is, or what I wanted to do, was make visible the realities of caring and link them to the bigger picture of the strains and on the structural conditions for caring. And I started out the research, and you'll see that in the presentation today, I started out the research really in the wake of the global financial crisis in 2008, and looking at the austerity measures and the effects of austerity. But then by the time I sort of completed the manuscript, this need to make this care crisis more visible in areas of public debate where it wasn't being spoken about sort of was a little bit obsolete as the pandemic had broken out, and the issues were much more visible. And so really, I think what this book does is well, it gives an explanation of sort of why care is in crisis and how we got to this situation, and also sort of poses the question of what we can do about it. And in all of this, my concern was really trying to sort of shift the lens away from the way that normally economy and policy are talked about. Normally, a lot of the focus is on things like gross domestic product, economic growth, and these sort of economic indicators. And I wanted to ask, what does the economy actually look like from the perspective of care? It begins from the care deficits that resulted from the financial crisis and the austerity measures and also the marketization of care. But it doesn't stop simply with establishing that there are care deficits. It challenges the idea that people stopped caring and tries to show instead how people are trying to do so under increasingly difficult conditions, and also trying to access care under increasingly difficult conditions. And I started to look at the ways in which the short-term kind of fixes, quick fixes to care that I saw happening didn't really address the underlying erosion of society's care infrastructures. So that was really the concern of the book. And what I want to do in today's talk, in about roughly 40 minutes, is first of all look at this lens of care and introduce you to some of the theoretical perspectives that I come from in the book and that I use to analyze care and the care crisis. And then I'll talk in more detail about what I mean by a care crisis, and you can see whether this also resonates with you and your work. I'll also spend some time focusing on the issues of privatization and the logics of financialization, which also I think form an important aspect of a lot of the contemporary debate, particularly around what we need to do in order to end the care crisis, where a lot of the time the focus is on alleviating underfunding, which is right and good, but I think not enough attention is paid to the effects and the consequences of privatization and the issues that we perhaps have to address there. So I'll spend some time speaking about that and linking that then back into some proposals of how to end the care crisis. That sounds rather grand, but perhaps discussing also with you and the where you're situated also perhaps within the third sector of what this means for you and what some of the solutions might be. And I hope then also that we have some time for questions and discussion. So let me begin then with the lens of care. So care is often quite a sort of vexed term, really, because it can mean so much and can sort of come to almost mean everything. And everyone needs care. Most people are also engaged in giving care in some way. And two academics who have been very important in coining a definition, Berenice Fisher and Joan Tronto, they provide a definition of care which is actually quite broad. They talk about care as a kind of species activity. It's something sort of that we as humans, in an activity that we engage in that's very much innate to our species, that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue and repair the world that we live in so that we can live in it as well as possible. So that really would encompass all sorts of relationships that we have throughout our lives that encompass maintaining and sustaining our relationships and our lives. But of course, care also has quite a specific context, particularly in the context of social care. And often people have quite specific needs across the life course. So Susan Himmelweiter, who is another academic and economist, defines care as the provision of personal services to meet those basic physical and mental needs that allow a person to function at a socially determined acceptable level of capability, comfort, and safety. And I think it's quite interesting here that as she includes in this definition socially determined acceptable level in order to reflect the social context in which also what is considered to be good quality care or adequate care arises. Another perspective, and I think an important perspective, is also offered by people coming from a disability rights perspective, who emphasize that these conversations about care and thinking about care also needs to encompass a perspective of equality with regards to disabilities, where it needs to be ensured that disabled people have access to the support that they need to live their lives on as equal terms as possible with non-disabled people. So here I think we have definitions of care, which on the one hand try to link caring and caring activities to the maintenance and reproduction of life and the relationships that that are part of that, but also are pointing to the specificities of care needs that people have to be physically and mentally well, and also to issues around equality of access to living well on the basis of people who perhaps are differentially abled and therefore require assistance, and that they need to have access to this assistance. And also I think another thing that disability rights movements draw attention to as well is that when we think about the sort of qualitative dimensions of care, sometimes care can be considered something that is sort of provided from one person to the next, and that person who receives care is just a passive recipient, whereas actually perhaps a more emancipatory notion of care would be one that also recognizes that care receivers participate also in the provision of care and need to have a say in what that looks like. Important too, I think, here is the perspective of paid care work in terms of the ways in which care work, when it is done for a wage and when it is done in a professional context, what that means in terms of how we think of care and what care is. And here I've put up the title of the trade union Uni Europa's manifesto, that make a link quite explicitly between quality jobs and quality services, to say that actually when we think about care, we also need to think about the conditions under which caring is actually provided. So what are levels of pay, what are the working conditions of care workers? And actually what we see at the moment is a lot of the time, and particularly in frontline care, care has quite low value. It is very feminized, so the minority of people are female, and also because of this low value, care sort of finds its way into the kind of structural discriminations of contemporary labour markets. So often those with very little bargaining power in the labour market are also ones who are doing frontline care, because it is low paid and the working conditions are not very good. So here we have a kind of intersection on the one hand with gender, but also with things like migration background or ethnicity. But care is also done unpaid, and in fact the majority of caring across society is done unpaid in familial or other personal relationships, or in communities. So this means that when we are thinking about what care is, we sort of need to look across these different realms of society to get the full picture of care. And of course, informal care and the situation of informal carers is also very important, also something that in the context of the pandemic has been brought to light too. I think one of the difficulties about care and defining care and sort of getting a handle on what we mean is, on the one hand, it's a lot of actually quite physical and hard work. It's not always nice, and it's not always easy, but also it has this kind of qualitative dimension. When we say to do something with care, means tending to doing something with concern or with attention or with affection. So care is tending to the needs of others, or one's own in the case of self-care, with concern and with affection, and with these sort of caring attitudes, and also within perhaps sympathetic bonds. But this is often also the source of its exploitation, in the sense that those people who have a sense of public service or a sense of responsibility or compassion often are the ones who continue to care under quite arduous conditions, precisely because they feel that they cannot not care. Whether this involves doing overtime in a paid context or also remaining engaged in care and caring for someone in an unpaid context. And so actually when we're looking at care, we're also looking at a context, sort of societal context, in which there are certain ideologies of caring as well. So there are certain assumptions around whose role it is to care in society, where that care takes place, what sorts of feelings or motivations are supposed to go with that. And they, of course, also in turn feed into then the structures of care that exist. So whether that's gender, the family being a locus of care, also ideas about charity, and recently the rise of the sort of self-care ideas. But then also, those of you who remember the Big Society, David Cameron's Big Society, will also perhaps recognize a kind of ideology of caring there too, that on the one hand sought to connect with ideas of community empowerment and decentralization of power, at the same time also actually acting as a kind of smoke screen for cuts, so sort of bringing in the community while at the same time resources were being cut. So caring is not simply a kind of affective or emotional or moral disposition, but it is also bound up with the distribution of labor and resources across society. Now, what do I mean by that? So I want to introduce another aspect of feminist theory that has to do with care, but uses a slightly different language, namely social reproduction. And this is the insight that when we look at our economy and the way that the economy works, a lot of the time we sort of focus on production, what happens where, you know, when people go to work and they get paid a wage and they're productive for the economy, they produce output, and that has economic value. And the feminist tradition that looks at social reproduction says, well, hang on a minute, there's actually this whole other realm of what we might call reproduction in the home, in the community, where there's a whole load of work being done that's often unpaid. That's actually the background condition for the economy. Without that work, there wouldn't be any labor power, and without that work, we wouldn't be able to live at all, let alone be economically productive. And I think this is very useful. It's not the same thing as care, but of course, a lot of that reproductive work or reproductive labor is also caring. It's also housework and things like that, but caring is a considerable part of it. And so we looking through the lens of care, then we can see that there is this whole area of life that is the condition really for the economy and for life itself. And often this is work that is very invisible. It's unpaid, it's not really seen, it's sort of relegated to the home, the community, and not acknowledged as such, and also therefore has a little value. So this is a sort of theoretical perspective on care and a sort of way into what it is that we mean by care, or what I mean by care. And really the important point here is to understand that care is something that we all need throughout our lives, but at the same time it is also something that individuals have specific needs at one time or another, but it is also work that's done that is often actually quite devalued in our society and rendered invisible or not attributed very much value. And of course, we could have a conversation about why that is, but I would say it's also part and parcel of why there is currently a care crisis that I think has been rendered particularly visible by the COVID pandemic. And to define a care crisis, I would say that we're dealing with a situation where, on the one hand, there is an increased inability that people have to access the care that they need to live well. For example, I don't know if there's anybody here this evening from Age UK, but Age UK a few years ago put out numbers about this, that there are estimates that in the UK, there, even 2 years ago, there were about 1.4 million older people who didn't have access to sufficient care that they needed. But a care crisis is also the difficult conditions under which people provide care, both paid and unpaid. And I would also argue that a care crisis is connected to care inequalities. And in an unequal society, of course, this inability to access care, and also the difficult conditions under which care is provided, that doesn't play out in an equal way, neither within societies or across societies. So all in all, then, what is driving a care crisis is really the exhaustion of societal care resources, all in all. And this has a number of causes. On the one hand, we have sort of structural changes to the way that the economy functions in terms of globalization and financialization that have sort of undermined what before was an assumption of a kind of reproductive deal. So there was an agreement, if you so will, that people would work and they would get a wage, and they would get enough to live, and also there was a welfare state that would also provide social security, and all of that has sort of been undermined by globalization and by financialization in many ways. So labor power can be reproduced elsewhere, or can be found elsewhere by moving production to other places, or the flight into kind of finance and looking for the possibility of making money there. And these processes sort of undermine the stability of this deal that was there before. But also, we have rising care needs, and I think many of you will be aware of this, that due to demographic changes, aging, and people living longer with more complex needs, means that care needs are rising. At the same time, those people who were considered often in an unpaid capacity to be the ones who were responsible for caring are now also participating more in the paid labor market. So particularly with greater female labor market participation, there's a kind of squeeze on the availability, particularly of women, for this caring, whether that's elder care, child care, all kinds of care. And at the same time, also, we have a kind of primacy of waged work, and that also in a context where one income for a household is for the most part no longer sufficient to pay for the needs of an entire family or household. So people are actually having to work more and more and more to have an appropriate income, and at the same time that obviously also squeezes the time available for care. And all the while we have austerity and welfare state retrenchment that means that services are not available in the same way, or social security is cut. And this goes hand in hand with privatization and the commodification of care, which means that services that are marketized mean that people have to be able to afford to pay for them, and also they become inserted in processes of wealth extraction that I will speak about a little bit later. And finally, I'd say part of this is also, you could argue, that's the question, is this a consequence or is this a cause? But certainly the politics of personal responsibility is also part of this as well, that people are told that they should rely on themselves, or they feel that they can only really rely on themselves, and that it's a sort of individual responsibility for care. I want to say a little bit more about the this context, particularly in the context of the UK. The focus of the book is also the UK, and we are talking in the context of the UK here. I think here what matters considerably also after 2008 is the austerity agenda that I think we are still seeing the effects of. And here I think a lot of the time we're aware, very aware of the effects of cuts, and in terms of the reduction or closure of services, particularly where local authorities are responsible for social care but have found their budgets liver that severely impinged upon, finding themselves having to do more with less, also here combined with overtime and stress, but also the tightening of eligibility criteria, which means that there is less access to care, because one way obviously of dealing with the situation of lack of resources is to have a strict interpretation of eligibility, or even reduce that eligibility somehow. And with these cuts, which also have involved the cuts of central government grants, there is for local authorities a greater reliance on council tax and business rates. So this, of course, means that councils are having to generate revenue somewhere, find ways of generating revenue. Raising council tax rates obviously also affects poorer households in particular. But also this affects poorer councils more than others. So here, this is also something that I think many of you will be aware of as something that has happened over more than a decade now. But also in terms of the services that are commissioned by councils, there's a kind of race to the bottom in terms of things like time and task commissioning, with the lack of available resources, overburdening of A&E, but also the reliance on charities and volunteers. So the rise of food banks post 2008, I think, is a good example of this. But I think one thing that perhaps many are not as aware of is the ways in which this austerity has also gone hand in hand with regressive tax reforms and sort of changes to the tax base, when we've had a real shift from the wealthier to the poorer, but also from businesses to individuals. So things like quantitative easing, releasing money, more money into the money supply, which actually mostly benefits people with assets because it leads to asset price inflation. Lowering personal tax allowances, of course, something that those who have higher amounts of wealth, that is better for them. But at the same time, increasing VAT, which is something, value-added tax, which is something that has also happened. This affects poorer households more because they expend a greater share of their income on value-added tax goods. Cuts to corporation tax, the Institute for Fiscal Studies calls cuts to corporation tax some of the biggest giveaways since 2009. And the Runnymede Trust actually has calculated this to say, well, the benefits and tax credit cuts cost poor people £37 billion, while £41 billion of tax cuts have advantaged the better off since 2008. So we really see this kind of shift also in terms of the distribution of wealth, while at the same time, the ways in which the welfare state has been restructured, not just through cuts, but also through sanctions, and the ways that social security is administered, means that it's almost become like a tool, like a weapon with which to reduce access to welfare. So the whole point is to sort of get people off welfare. Benefits and services are cut. And there's a kind of punitive environment, there's stigmatization, and Peter Taylor Gooby, for example, has called this a sort of welfare has become a sort of engine of social division as opposed to social cohesion, which it actually is intended to be. But all in all, even though there is this sort of stigmatization and this sort of narrative against public spending, the reality is actually that half of the British population receives benefits or tax credits at some point in their lives, and there's a cross-section of society make use daily of the services provided by local authorities. And also 42% of Britain's welfare expenditure actually goes on pensions. So what are the implications of all of this? Well, actually, overall, social security spending, despite cuts, continues to increase because there is rising economic inequality. And also what economists have called a regressive recovery. So expenditure on housing benefits is higher due to the rising costs of housing, but also income spent on in-work benefits is low due to low wages, is higher due to low wages, sorry. But also demographic developments, more people of pension age and more people claiming disability and incapacity benefits. But this upwardly mobile wealth is really a considerable issue here. So tax revenues have actually risen by nearly 2%, so between 2010 and 2020, that is. But this 2% has in effect been taken from those who are least able to afford it. And I think it's those sorts of restructurings that often kind of get lost in the kind of aggregate ways that we talk about these issues. And another thing is also that this is something that the UK Equality and Human Rights Commission has pointed out, that the reforms that happened, regardless of what you think about whether or not these policies were correct, the way that they were done and the people who were affected, that wasn't inevitable. And so actually these reforms in and of themselves were regressive. But also, and I said this in the beginning as well, just because it becomes more difficult to care or to access care, it doesn't mean that care needs go away. And so actually, I think in the wake of all of this, what we've also seen is an offloading of the responsibility for care to households and families who either have to do the work themselves or they have to pay for expensive services if they can afford to. But also households are pushed closer to financial products and services, whether this is debt or mortgages, insurance, but also, of course, the financialization of pensions is part of these processes as well. So, and this is something that I think not only households are affected by, but also organizations, and I think also third sector organizations are also under a lot of pressure to sort of come up with ways of finding funding, not just through grants or donations, but also through generating new kinds of business models and models that can actually provide an income, perhaps also through selling services or other kinds of private commercialized models. So I think here we see that in the wake also of these cuts, there is an opening also for these changes that are really put on individuals and organizations to go in a particular direction. And of course, Brexit and the pandemic have added pressures here. I won't go into too much detail about that, but we could also talk about that in the discussion on the specifics of that. But I did want to mention the health and social care levy that has been announced, or that was announced in September, because I think this is an important response to the sort of crisis situation, particularly the crisis in social care. I would argue that the care crisis is much bigger than the social care crisis, but particularly the funding crisis in social care is very acute. The health and social care levy, as you will know, is a levy that is taken from national insurance contributions and also dividends, income from dividends. But the issue here is that most of the new funding will go to the NHS rather than social care. So a considerable amount of it is of the funds that will be generated over the next 3 years is intended to deal with the backlog in the NHS. And I think only a small amount of the numbers are, I think, 36 billion to the NHS and 5.4 to social care. that's one aspect. The other is that nearly all of this, nearly half of this funding will be used to pay for reforms. That should say nearly half, sorry, will be used to pay for the reforms that are going to take place. So there's going to be a new cap on the cost of care, where over a certain amount the state will step in, and also the access in terms of eligibility is also changing. But of course, all of that will cost money, and a lot of the new money will go towards funding that. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies, for example, points out that that will actually grow the need to fund that. So councils will still face shortfalls, but also there aren't any funds really for increasing staff, improving wages and working conditions in the care sector. And also, there are no regulations are going to happen that will deal with some of the consequences of privatization and financialization and the effects that these have had. And in the remaining few minutes that I have, I want to talk a bit specifically about these aspects, because I think here there is a really urgent conversation about this. Now, privatization and marketization, public-private partnerships, these sorts of things were supposed to improve public services through competition, and they were supposed to generate savings through greater cost efficiency, higher productivity. But actually, across different sectors where this has happened, we've seen considerable problems. So, for example, in the area of care homes, here in particular, the developments have included the entry of financialized chains, so the entry of private equity, hedge funds, and real estate investment trusts into this area. They expect quite high rates of return on their investments in an area which is actually not really generative of high productivity, but the need here to sort of create economies of scale and in order to render these profitable often happens off the back of working conditions and wages. Also things like leveraged buyouts that are used here, where companies are bought and loaded with lots of debt, mean that then this debt has to be paid with interest, and this becomes very unsustainable over time, not least of course in an economic downturn where perhaps investors can protect their assets. Actually their care homes and others, and certainly residents and workers, are less able to do so. Also, with corporatized structures, a lot of the funds, there's the calculations here that about 10% of funds with regard to care homes actually leak out of the sector in terms of rent and dividend payments, net interest payments, directors' fees, profits before tax, and that sort of thing. But also in home care, there's a situation where providers have been handing back contracts to councils because they say they can't actually deliver in ways that also would keep their business models afloat. We have 0 hours contracts, non-payment of travel time, and these sorts of things happening in home care. Also, with regard to the pandemic, we've seen through reports that there's been a reliance on a kind of just-in-time contracts for PPE, and also expensive private contracts and test and trace systems that were not always effective. And other things here include like the digital welfare state, where we see a sort of privatization of public cost savings through new digital platforms. So Babylon Health, GP at Hand are things here. I write about them in the book for anyone who's interested in reading more about that. And another thing that perhaps is also something that those of you in the third sector will have come across a lot more is perhaps the social impact bonds and these sort of new kinds of public-private partnerships where funds are sought from private investors, often philanthropic investors, to remedy certain social problems like loneliness in old age or recidivism, and then investors are paid a return on their investment with the successful completion of the project, which is often actually orientated, certainly in the models that exist, many of the models that exist to date and have been trialed, are modeled on the idea of cost savings, either actual cost savings or future cost savings to the public purse. So there's a question there, I think, in terms of privatization of public funds. Okay, I wanted to say a little bit also about the logics of financialization in particular, because I think with privatization, we can understand some of the ways in which the orientation towards profitability and competition can place pressures, particularly on areas where there is such low productivity and not so much scope for creating the kinds of economies of scale that would be necessary, or also where just parts of or sectors that don't lend themselves to this kind of privatization and marketization, like, for example, care. But the logic of finance or financialization is also specific again. And I think the important point here, perhaps the takeaway that I would like to give you, is that I think a lot of the time finance is sort of seen as sort of giving resources, so there's a sort of way of getting resources. But actually, I think it's important to look at the precise mechanisms at play that actually are facilitating wealth extraction in terms of sort of returns on investments, and they change the processes that they come to, where they're used, and that they come to inform them. They change relations of power, but also they reorganize the relationships between production and reproduction. And in my book, I spend some time unpacking these issues also with regards to things like volunteering and social impact bonds, for those of you who are interested. So I'd like to come to a close of my whirlwind tour of the care crisis and say a few words about, so what might we do about the situation overall? I think it's really important to stress that care is not a luxury good. Everybody needs to be cared for, and everyone needs access to care. So it can't actually be commodified in the way that is attempted. We also need to truly value care, need to allocate more time, more money, more societal capacities to care. And that includes expanding a public infrastructure funded through progressive taxation. And I think it's important to try and think of how we might, rather than sort of going in this direction of wealth extraction, how could we develop new models for community or cooperative ownership, while also improving employment conditions and remuneration in the sector, as well as training opportunities for further qualification, more staff, and these sorts of things. So I think with regards to the paid care, there is a real task there in terms of really providing more resources and thinking of different models of ownership. But there's also, I think, an aspect where we need to think of unpaid care, and how there will also still be lots of unpaid care that is done, because caring is also part of how we live and relate to one another. And so how might we reclaim time from waged work to do so, but also redistribute care work differently beyond the confines of the nuclear family, and in ways that support existing informal carers. And I think a final aspect, which for those of you also in the third sector is perhaps an important point, is sort of care and democracy. And I think it's important to take seriously also the critique of the bureaucratic, paternalistic, top-down state, and thinking about, okay, so how could we have collective public infrastructures that are bottom-up, where personalization is not the same thing simply as consumer choice, where we take seriously things like co-production and real innovation, actually, rather than commercial experimentation. And here I think also remunicipalization, sort of bringing services back in-house, while also thinking of these cooperative and different ownership models, is perhaps a productive way forward. Thanks very much. I look forward to your comments and questions. And I know that was sort of quite a lot of information in a short space of time, but I hope we also have a little bit of time to discuss. Thank you.